Good. So I thought what I'd do as we start to sort of come to the end of this meeting is almost just sum up and try to look into the future. And what I'm going to look at is both research and treatment of aHUS. So to start off with, I'm going to deal with research. And I'm going to sort of put some questions. So what do we know at the present moment in terms of really firm facts? And I'm not going to go into micro areas of research. I'm trying to deal in areas that I think are relevant for you as patients and families. So we now know over the last 15 years that about 70% of patients with atypical aHUS will have an abnormality affecting complement. In the majority of individuals, this will be a mutation and a faulty gene, which will be in majority inherited. A small number of people will have an acquired defect, and by acquired, I mean it comes over on off with time, and this is usually in the form of antibodies, which Neil's talked about antibodies, and these antibodies are against the same complement proteins that we actually find faulty genes in. We also know that not everybody who has a genetic abnormality will develop the disease. And Judith showed you the penetrance data, so there are about a third of people who will be carrying a gene who throughout their lives will remain perfectly healthy and well and will not develop the disease. We think that in the majority of individuals that you need a trigger to start the disease, so that you need something to set it going. We do recognize that many people say that they've felt as if they've had flu or a bacterial illness, and some people who actually have diarrhea, but it will turn out not to be E. coli 157. One of the strongest triggers that we do recognize, however, is pregnancy. And the figures that we would quote is that if we know somebody has or a faulty gene, that pregnancy is associated with the development of aHUS in about 1 in 8 pregnancies. Not fantastic data, but it doesn't mean every time somebody gets pregnant who's got a faulty gene that they are going to develop aHUS. So let me put the flip side about what don't we know, what do I think it is important that we try and find out for your future, your care. Well, I think it's really important that we actually identify what the abnormality is in the other 30%. From what Neil talked about, it looks as though those people respond to eculizumab in just the same way as people who have identified abnormalities, which suggests to me that we are going to find something in other complement genes. And as Matthew said, there are a whole host of proteins, and over the years we've been slowly picking them off one by one. So we've been going to one gene to the other gene, and it's pretty laborious doing that. We're up to 6 genes we look at now. One of the best ways, and the way we started off, was to identify faults in families. Because if you can identify a fault, and that fault is found in every member in a family who is affected by the disease, that is very strong evidence that it is that fault that is responsible for the disease in that family. Now, techniques have changed enormously since Paul Warwicker did his first study in 1995 and published in 1998. What we tended to do is we thought, oh, that gene could be a possible gene, and so we go and look at that gene and see if we can find a fault in it. So we've been moving from gene to gene. We're actually probably going to take a different tack now, in that modern techniques allow us to look at every gene in an individual at one time. So it is possible now, with modern techniques, to cover 90% of all genes at one go. So with the families who remain where we don't know what the cause is, what we're going to do is look at the DNA from all the affected members and see whether they carry faults in common in potential genes that might be involved in the complement pathway. And I think that will prove to be very powerful in identifying the other genes that are implicated in this. I'm still really interested in why some individuals in whom there's a genetic abnormality don't develop the disease. We do have some clues. We do know that there are certain other genes, so let's say if you had an abnormality in factor H, we know that if you have a normally occurring variant, normally seen in a normal population in another gene called CD46, that can sometimes increase your risk of developing the disease. So it looks as if one gene can affect how active an abnormality is in another gene, and that's something we're following at the present moment to see if, are we possible perhaps in the future with individual carriers to say, look, we think the risk in you of developing the disease is pretty low. So the final thing that really I think will tell us a lot about the disease is what is it about pregnancy that triggers it? And I'm asked this question, and I don't have a clue at the present moment. We know that it tends to occur very late in pregnancy, and in fact, the majority of people who get aHUS associated with pregnancy get it after pregnancy, so they have a normal delivery, and then afterwards they develop aHUS. Why I think it's really important for pregnancy is because when we look at what happens in people who develop aHUS associated with pregnancy, the outcome is probably the poorest of all groups. Virtually everybody who gets it, and I know there may be individuals who are exceptional, will develop kidney failure. And they will probably develop kidney failure very quickly, from which they will not recover the kidney function. So there are a variety of things that we can think about doing to look at why that stage in pregnancy, particularly, I think does something to the endothelium that makes it at risk of getting this disease. So that's research. So those are the important questions that I'd like to look at that I think will tell us more about how we can treat the disease. What about the treatment? Well, I wanted to show you the figures that we've got recently for how many patients in the UK are actually affected by the disease. So the way that we've done this, we have contacted every pediatric and adult renal unit in the UK and asked them, how many patients have you got with this disease? One of the problems with this is that, as we've already seen today, I think it sometimes goes unrecognized. And so that sometimes that we will see somebody in a unit, in a kidney unit, who it's never been recognized that their initial disease was atypical aHUS, and then they'll get a transplant, and then they'll get recurrent disease in the transplant. And when you look back retrospectively, you can say, yes, that person did have atypical aHUS as the initial cause of their disease. So I think, and this is the minimum data, that there are 172 patients in the UK, with 134 in England, 23 in Scotland, 12 in Wales, and 3 in Northern Ireland. Now, when I first started to talk about aHUS, I used to say, as somebody mentioned earlier, but this is a disease of children. It's not a disease that affects adults. But if you look at the figures here, of 172, 49 are under the age of 18. So the majority of individuals who are said to have this disease in this country are adults. Now, it may be that they first presented in childhood and are now adults, but I still think, and as we've seen today, a large number of people are going to present with this disease in adulthood. It's not just a disease of children. When you look at other groups around the world who have studied what happens in individual countries, the thing that comes out again and again and again, but seems to be more common in females than males. Now, one possible explanation for that is that it's pregnancy that's precipitating it, but I don't think, when I've looked at our data, that we can explain the excess of females versus of males on pregnancy alone. So again, this is telling, I think, there's something about the biology of a disease that we need to look at further. Of the 172 patients, 62 are definitely on dialysis. Now, we've heard earlier that the outcome of transplantation in the majority of patients, particularly those who are known to have an abnormality in factor H or factor I, is poor. And it perhaps doesn't surprise me that only 9 of the 62 patients who are on dialysis are actually active on the renal transplant list at the present moment. And that's something we need to address. There are 110 patients who aren't on dialysis. 20 of those have a functioning transplant. Now, that just goes to say that there are some patients who've been transplanted who've not got a recurrence of disease. But even those people who have a functioning transplant, I think, are still at risk of getting a recurrence in the disease. In most people, the recurrence of the disease occurs within a very short period of time after transplantation or within the first year. But every so often, we see somebody who 9 years after a transplant comes in with a recurrence of disease. So it's not totally unusual to see it a very late recurrence. 29 patients have what we call chronic kidney disease. There is evidence that the aHUS has severely affected their kidney function and it is not normal. 9 people, and these are a mixture between those who've got a functioning transplant, those who've got normal renal function, and those with chronic kidney disease, are undergoing regular plasma exchange. Majority are undergoing plasma exchange once a week. Some are going once every 2 weeks, some 1 or 2 times a week. So there are, I think, 6 patients on eculizumab. We've seen one of them today. There are another 2 adults from the trials who have carried on after the trial had finished in an extension arm. And everybody who's on eculizumab from those trials is doing really well at the present moment. And what's come over from hearing the stories like we heard today, but also the people who are not here, is how much better they feel on eculizumab than they did before they were on plasma exchange. There are 3 children whose primary care trusts have agreed to fund the purchase of eculizumab. And there's one in London, I think there's one in Wales, and one in the southwest. On the other hand, there are another 3 PCTs, primary care trusts, who have turned down applications for eculizumab to be funded. So I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So the other thing I'm interested in, so what I told you about in that last slide is what I would call the prevalence. How many people are there with this condition who are alive in the UK at the present moment, and what's happening to them? As we start to plan for the future, and particularly plan for how much eculizumab we might need to be prescribing, what I've been trying to do is get really good data on how commonly is this occurring. So this is what we call incidence, new cases. So what I asked renal units to provide me with was data for 2009 and 2010 of how many new patients presented with this disease that they could recognize as having the disease, and then I was interested in what happened to them. And in 2009, there were records of 11 new patients, and of those, 3 are on dialysis, 5 have a normal kidney function, but 2 of them are on regular plasma exchange. 1's been transplanted, and 2 have advanced chronic kidney disease. Now, there has been increasing interest in this disease, and I think clinicians, nephrologists, are starting to recognize it more. So it's perhaps not a surprise to me, but double the amount of patients in 2010 have been diagnosed with the disease. 3 are deceased, 5 are on dialysis, 8 have normal renal function, 2 again on plasma exchange, and 4 have advanced chronic kidney disease. Now, when you ask other groups around the world, what's the incidence, how many new patients do you see per year, they usually quote a figure of 1 per million population. So if we took the UK population of 60 million, we should be seeing at least 60 patients per year. Now, we're not seeing 60 patients per year, which makes me doubt and say either we're not recognizing this or the actual figures that are quoted elsewhere are wrong. I suspect that it's probably about 0.5 per million population, the incidence per year. And so what I'm doing in my head is working out how much is that going to cost if we treated every new patient who presented every year with eculizumab. So what do we know about the treatment at the present moment? Well, plasma therapy, I believe, is successful in only a minority of patients. The majority will develop end-stage renal failure. In those who it is initially successful, they will often need long-term treatment to prevent recurrent relapses of a disease, and we've heard about that already today. Most patients, and again, there are going to be exceptions, so if you're the exception sitting there, ignore what I'm saying now, but most patients will need dialysis within 3 years of when they present. And transplantation of a kidney alone in those who are now on dialysis has a poor outcome, particularly in those patients who have a factor H or factor I mutation because of a risk of recurrence in the transplant. And when we look at the figures for factor H and factor I, the figures I give to an individual patient who's got one of those abnormalities is that you have an 80% chance of losing a kidney to recurrent disease within 2 years of transplantation. And so I think that probably goes to explain why so few patients are now still active on the transplant list. What else do we know? I think, as Neil pointed out earlier on, if you start eculizumab early enough, it can prevent the development of kidney failure in somebody who develops the disease for the first time. What I think is going to be crucial in the future is to recognize the disease as early as possible and treat it as early as possible to gain the greatest benefit from the drug. Likewise, if somebody gets a recurrence in a transplant, so all those transplanted patients who are, I still think, at risk, again, recognizing that they've got a recurrence of a disease in the transplant early and treating it with eculizumab, I think is going to be crucial. I also believe that eculizumab, as we've heard today, if you give it prophylactically, in somebody who's had a recurrence before of a disease in a previous transplant, will prevent the recurrence of a disease in a new transplant. And as Pat said, liver-kidney transplantation is a cure. It cures the disease. But you have to think of the long-term benefits against the short-term risks, and the risks of liver-kidney transplantation are short-term. So what don't we know about treatment? One thing that I'm struggling with is whether we are going to need to give eculizumab forever in individuals. So once you're on it, does it mean you're going to be on it for life, or could you stop it and then give it if you have another relapse? There is some data from the trials that have been done at the present moment that if you do stop eculizumab, in the majority of patients, there is a tendency for the disease to relapse quite quickly after stopping it, and it may be necessary, therefore, it to begin. I suspect as I try to make plans for how we're going to use eculizumab, I'm going to plan that everybody's going to be on it for life to start off with. Now, that may change with time, but I think if we're going to pay for it, we've got to plan that everybody's going to be on it for life. Is it better to have a kidney transplant alone with eculizumab or a liver-kidney transplant? And I think Pat very nicely summarized the risk-benefits of those two. And when I sit down with individual patients who come up here to see me, we often spend quite a lot of time going over which one of those two. I find it very difficult to predict what somebody's going to decide. Some people say, no way am I having a liver-kidney transplant. Other people say, yeah, but that's for me. And it's very much an individual thing that people are going to make their minds up about, having gone through with individuals the risk-benefit ratio. So, what's my vision for aHUS? Well, I'd like to think that in the future, that aHUS is not a cause of kidney failure for which people are dialyzed. So I'd like to think that we can prevent new patients developing kidney failure. I'd like to think that those 62 patients who are present or on dialysis, that we can enable them to be transplanted with good long-term graft function, either with a liver-kidney transplant or the use of eculizumab. I'd like to think, and I think this is perhaps blue sky thinking at the present moment, that is there something we can do for healthy carriers that changes their risk? Is there some simple treatment that you could go on that will actually decrease the risk of a faulty gene manifesting as the disease? I think we're a long way off that at the present moment. So, how might we achieve the vision I've painted for you? Well, currently, eculizumab, as we discussed earlier, is licensed for the treatment of paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria. And this is run as a central service from Leeds and from King's College Hospital. And they have a very similar number of patients who are currently treated with eculizumab as we would potentially be treating with in aHUS. So based on the evidence from the trials, an application for the use of eculizumab in aHUS has been submitted to the regulatory body who approve a drug to be used for a new indication. So I could prescribe eculizumab off-label for somebody if I could find the funding for it, but we can't start to market it as a treatment until it's actually got approval from a regulatory agency. Now, in Europe, it's the EMEA, and in America, it's the FDA. So once that approval is granted in the form of a license, then it can be put out as a recognized treatment for the disease. That doesn't mean we've got the funding for it, but it will become a recognized treatment for the disease. At the present moment, it's only an experimental treatment for the disease. This is where some people gulp. Eculizumab is expensive. Forbes rated it as the most expensive drug in the world. And to be on it long-term as an adult cost approximately £250,000 per year. So let me explain to you how treatment in the NHS, a very simple guide, is paid for. It's usually paid for locally by your primary care trust. So if you need a hip replacement, your commissioning primary care trust, or as they're going to be in the future, GP commissioning consortium, will have paid your local hospital for that. Now, of course, one primary care trust would be bankrupt if we said, right, you're going to have to come up with £250,000 per year for this patient long term. So when a condition is as rare as atypical aHUS and the treatment is very expensive, there are mechanisms for not bypassing it, but for the commissioning, the purchasing of the treatment for those patients to be done on a national basis. And this is what we're actually involved with in the present moment, is trying to achieve what we call a nationally commissioned service for atypical aHUS. So this is how the system works. This is a cartoon. So the entry criteria for this is that you have to have a disease that is rare and complex. So we pass go with aHUS. And then there are a series of core criteria that you have to prove. You have to prove that there is a health gain with the new treatment. I think there's undoubtedly, on the evidence that you've seen today, that eculizumab passes that. You have to prove that it has societal value, that it's a benefit to society. Now, if we can stop people developing kidney failure that needs dialysis, there's a huge societal benefit from that. You have to prove it's a reasonable cost. That is slightly more tricky. What we do is we cost up what the current treatments are, hemodialysis, plasma exchange, and then we say, well, that's what it costs currently to treat somebody. This is what it would cost to treat them with eculizumab. Now, you don't need to be a mathematical genius to see that the figures are stacked up against that one at the present moment, but that should not be a breaker for this. Finally, you have to show that it is best practice. Certainly the results of the studies to date would suggest to me that eculizumab is undoubtedly, it's one of my colleagues said, this is like penicillin. You don't need multiple tests to show that this works. It works. And, you know, from what you've heard today already, it certainly does work. So these are the questions that are being asked at present. Does it work? Severity of patients. Does it add value to society? Is it a reasonable cost to the public? And so I'm giving all sorts of figures about average cost to patient. And is it the best way of delivering the service? So what we've done at the end of December, we had to put in an outline application for aHUS to become a nationally commissioned service. And in that, we had to give an estimate of the number of patients in the UK who had this condition and what it would cost to treat them and investigate them in a central national service. And we put that in, and when I added up the sums, I had to tap my calculator a few times because it came to the sum for 5 years, it came to 110 million. And our finance officer got the decimal point in the wrong place when he looked at it. He said he thought it was 11.0 million, so he said there's no problem with that. And then we had to say to him, actually, it's 110 million. Are you certain? You know, so he gulped as well. So it was 110 million that we were thinking might be the cost of this treatment. You know. There's a precedent, however, that paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria has the same number of patients who are probably less disadvantaged by health as our patients with atypical aHUS are already getting it. So if patients with PNH are getting it, there is no reason to my mind why patients with atypical aHUS shouldn't get it as well. So we put in the outline application, and we were in competition, I think, with 30 other applications, and we're shortlisted, so that we've been in a shortlist of 7 now. So at this very moment, at the end of June, we have to submit a full application to the national commissioners for this service. It has quite a lot of backing, obviously, from the renal community, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how you can help us. So what will this national service comprise? First of all, it means all genetic investigations will be done centrally and paid for here. At the present moment, genetic investigations, if we screen somebody fully, it costs about £2,000, and that has to be paid for, again, by either the unit that the patient's coming from or the PCT. And there are cases where people have refused to even pay that £2,000. So that would be overcome, that would all be paid for centrally, so we would do it. Again, eculizumab would be paid for centrally. To get that, the investigation treatment would have to be shared between Newcastle, which is where the planned centre would be, and local renal units. So we will be working in a very much a shared care system already. And that's already going on because lots of you, I get phone calls a lot about lots of you in terms of what should I be doing, what's the next thing I should be doing for this person, what investigations do. So that's already happening to a degree. So we're going to formalize, in a way, what's already going on. It doesn't mean that individual patients will have to come to Newcastle. We, if this is successful, will be coming to you. So that if you live in Exeter, we'll be coming down to that region to do a clinic to see you and monitor you if you're on eculizumab. So that there's not going to be a travelling issue for people. So patients don't have to travel to Newcastle. So that's about what we're doing in terms, and I'll come back a minute about what I think you could be doing for us. So we'll hear about the outcome of that in September, and if we're successful, we would be able to start using eculizumab on a nationally commissioned service in April 2012, so next year. So what do I think about the options for patients who are currently on dialysis, those 62 patients? Well, they could go for a kidney transplant alone. I think the majority of patients are not opting for that because of a high risk of recurrence. You could, and there are a small number of people, very few in the UK, some in Europe, have gone for plasma exchange prior to a kidney transplant alone and then long-term. And in a few patients that has been successful, but in some of them they break through and get a recurrence of the disease. We've heard about combined liver-kidney transplant, and we've heard about the possibility of using kidney transplant alone with eculizumab given immediately prior to a transplant. And I think it's these two that are going to be the sort of the key treatments for the patients who are currently on dialysis. And obviously, time will tell which one proves to be the most beneficial treatment. Obviously, with eculizumab, it brings up the same question. If we transplant somebody with prophylactic eculizumab, do they need to be given it long-term? And I suspect we will probably be giving it long-term, but that may change with time. So this is my last slide. So what about, there's a series of patients who are going to be coming in as new patients, and I reckon it's going to be about between 30 to 40 patients a year as we start to recognize it. There are going to be patients who perhaps have chronic kidney disease or normal renal function who are going to relapse, and we're going to be some of the transplant patients who will get a recurrence. So what could we do for those? Well, we could give them plasma therapy acutely and possibly long-term, but I think the treatment of choice is going to be eculizumab. I really do, and I think that to treat people as quickly as possible is going to be an important thing to do. But again, the question that comes to me, does everybody need long-term treatment? And I just don't have the answer to this. So, as I said, the application for national commissioning will be sent off at the end of this month, and it will then be considered by an advisory group called the Advisory Group for National Specialised Services, and they will make a recommendation to the Minister of Health. And the Minister of Health will look at that recommendation, but also look at other factors as well. No matter how much we as a profession say to ministers, MPs, it has very little effect. What you say to MPs and ministers has a huge effect. So that if you write to your MP and ask, is eculizumab going to be available for me if I have a transplant next year? And if not, why not? And that MP is mandated to actually raise that issue with the Minister of Health. And the Minister of Health then has to write back to the MP to say, give a reason for this. And it's the Minister of Health who will ultimately make the decision later this year whether this drug is going to be available for the treatment of atypical aHUS. So I think that we are going to be asking if you will support us in trying to get support from MPs, ministers for this treatment. You may say it's a big cost, but in fact, well, one thing this government have said that they will do is they are going to tighten up on doing hip replacements. They're going to tighten up on what I would call chronic diseases. They're going to make those as cost-effective as possible, but they still want to see innovative new treatments for rare diseases. So they have kept money back for this. So they will, just because it's going to cost whatever I told you earlier on, it does not mean that it won't go through. But what we have to do is adequately prove our case and adequately lobby and make certain that case is as well heard as possible. I actually think, I think the combination of liver kidney transplant, but particularly eculizumab, just heralds a huge change to this disease. I mean, to my mind, it has had a really bad prognosis for many individuals, and I think eculizumab could just dramatically change it, and I think we've already seen that it's dramatically changed it. So I'd like to think that what we're presenting to you today represents either the beginning of the end or the end of a beginning for a disease that, as we've heard from the stories, has devastating consequences for both individuals and families. So I'll be pleased to take any of your questions, but I've tried to sort of summarize where we are and where I think things are going. So thanks very much. Anybody want to ask me a question?
Thank you. I note the cost of the eculizumab. Will it get cheaper if there are more patients using it? Is it one of these drugs that will come cheaper with use?
Well, the very nature of treating rare diseases with what we call orphan drugs is that they tend to be very expensive. What often happens, however, is that when you start to use an orphan drug, you find that it is relevant for other diseases. So that, for instance, the diarrhea-associated form of aHUS, there have been recent reports of the use of eculizumab in the diarrheal form. And in some patients with diarrheal-associated, a very small minority get really sick. And it's been found that in those patients, and there was a report of this in one of our major medical journals, it seems to be having quite a dramatic effect. So, but in Germany at the present moment, and you probably know in the German outbreak of the E. coli aHUS, that the individuals in that outbreak are much more likely to get aHUS, and they're much more likely to get sick, and they're much more likely to be adults. Eculizumab has been provided on a compassionate basis by Alexion for the really very sick individuals in Germany. And what we will see from those may mean that there's another treatment, but another disease. So the more diseases there, the cheaper they become. I don't think it's going to get any more expensive, and I predict the cost will fall with time. But, you know, for something like this, you've got to start.
Hi. It's just going back to the topic of the contraceptive pill again. It seems to be quite a popular thing in this room, and from, you know, I've had my condition for about 15 years now, and I've heard stories. And how seriously is it actually being taken as a trigger?
It's a really difficult question to answer. And I think what we've lacked previously, which we will have in the future, is good, what we call prospective cohorts of people. So that as we set up the registry that Mark talked about earlier on, we will be able to characterize very much better what the risks are in individuals, so that in future we're going to be looking into the future, and we will be able to identify every patient who comes in with disease. How many of them are? You know, I don't think I can answer either one way or the other about the oral contraceptive at the present moment.
On the subject of triggers, could a common influence be hormones or hormone balance or imbalance, contraceptive pill and pregnancy? My aHUS trigger was around the time of the menopause in my early 50s. So we're talking about hormone imbalance there.
One of the things we do know, and it's something that's interested me for a while, is that both estrogen and progesterone have quite a marked effect on endothelial cells, the cells that we were talking about earlier on that line blood vessels. And one of the things I've often wondered is whether changing levels of estrogens and progestogens can actually change the level at which a cell can become activated. It's a research question, but so I'm not giving you a clinical answer at the present moment, but I think your hypothesis is quite possible. Yes.
Obviously, Caroline is on the eculizumab just now, and obviously with the cost she's saying it's 250 grand a year. Where does Caroline kind of stand if the government don't approve this?
Well,
where does it stand? Does she then go back to, and in the primary care trust, they decide they're not paying the 250 grand a year? Does Caroline then go back to bouncing in at a hospital every 2 months or whatever, or relapsing constantly then? Came back out of the treatment she was on before?
Yeah, well, we certainly hope not. Alexion have been very generous in what they've done, and they have never, with paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, ever withdrawn supply of drug for a patient. So although Alexion cannot guarantee that for 20 years or whatever that they're going to provide this drug free of charge, I think it very unlikely. I think likely they will continue to provide it until we get national commissioning for this service.
Tim, can you address whether we think there might be any long-term complications of eculizumab treatment? We're obviously very enthusiastic about the use in the short term, but can you address the long-term issue?
Well, we have 8 years information in paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria without any serious long-term consequences. Whether that information is transferable to another disease is, you can't be certain. I think what we can say is that we will be monitoring everybody in eculizumab very carefully long-term, looking for these things. But I know I can't guarantee for you that 30 years of eculizumab may be associated with something, but that's something we will have to monitor very closely.